My pleasure to introduce a friend and someone I have deep respect for, Reverend Lindsay Geist. As a licensed clinical social worker and an ordained deacon in the United Methodist Church, Lindsay opened her own private practice called Seeds of Hope Counseling in 2016, which serves individuals experiencing anxiety, depression, faith concerns, and many other concerns. Most recently, she served as the Director of Wellbeing at the North Georgia Conference of the United Methodist Church, providing mental health resource support for more than 1,300 active and retired clergy, including designing and teaching clergy ethics to more than 850 clergy. And that's the thing I want to highlight, that one of the things I've most appreciated about her work is connecting dots between clergy health and clergy ethics. And I think you'll pick up on that today. To get things started, I want to welcome you, Lindsay, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Chris. I am really excited about being here today and being able to share with y'all. I know that we have had a lot of several people that have served as researchers and shared a lot of their information, which I find so helpful to connect kind of how to implement things on the ground. And as someone that has served often as in a practitioner role, it is exciting to take that information on the ground and then share some of that on the ground information that we are learning back with everyone. So like we said, I taught recently clergy ethics to more than 850 United Methodist clergy across North Georgia. And how I ended up doing that is that I have spent a number of years of my career studying and teaching all about self-care for years. And the last 3 years, I have intentionally focused on clergy care and well-being and self-care. And most recently, as we said, I finished designing and teaching and leading this training around clergy ethics. And so as I was preparing for that and teaching it and leading it, it started raising a lot of questions for me that I wanted us to start asking and I wanted to start exploring. Now, to understand how I got into this project, this is a required project, required training for United Methodist clergy every 4 years. It is mandatory, so you don't get a choice of whether you want to opt in or opt out. To many people's chagrin, they don't get an option, even if they believe that they know everything already. And what clergy ethics covers is the do's and don'ts of ministry. Here are the black and white areas. Here are the gray areas. Here are the expectations we have of you. And so this is something that has been taught every 4 years for decades in North Georgia and lots of other United Methodist conferences. And people have said, oh, I have taken this, about 8 times or something like that. And yet they're continue to be required to come back and take it again. And so it made me think that if this is something required to take every 4 years, and we still have clergy violating boundaries, even though they have been there to hear this information, and even though they've heard all this, they're still causing harm to others. And when you violate a boundary, having your credentials revoked. So obviously, we're not getting at the root of what is going on. We're teaching the information, and so it's not lack of knowledge anymore. What may have been at the beginning is no longer true. We've expanded the curriculum every 4 years, added new areas to it. Some that have stayed the same, they have gotten the same information every time. And so even though we've expanded the curriculum, it has not eliminated violations. It's reduced some of them, but not eliminated them. Really, it reduced the accidental violations of the people that simply didn't know along the way. And so if we wanted to point the finger at lack of knowledge, I would assume that a comprehensive curriculum would have fixed that. And that is not the case of what's been happening. So it made me want to ask even more questions. So when I led ethics, I wanted to make it interactive with clergy that we were serving. And so I asked them this question: what boundaries do you struggle with most? And this is simply a summary of the 850 plus responses that we got. These are some of the key highlights. And what's fascinating is this question we asked about you. What boundaries do you struggle with the most? And the first boundary that people said was self-care. That they really don't know how to hold a boundary around self-care, how to do it, what it even is. That often came up in questions for people. And then oversharing, that they're telling too much to people, or struggling with relationships by having congregants as friends. How much are you telling to your friends or not? I think the next two go hand in hand, being able to say no and people pleasing. And then mental health. People struggling to care for themselves, to make a priority of time for that or know how to. People reported struggling with time. How do you have enough time off? Time management. Just how do we create more hours in the day or use it well? I was fascinated that people noted burnout, loneliness, and Sabbath. We know from lots of research that has been done that burnout is common among clergy. We have too many tasks that we are expected to do, not enough time, as noted here. And so we are all exhausted and getting ready to leave and tired of dealing with all the divisiveness that is happening. People also noted struggling with physical boundaries, weight, and food. A popular one and something that's talked about all the time, every time ethics is taught, is declining gifts. What is acceptable to accept and not? Can you say yes to the trip on the yacht with your parishioner down to the Caribbean if they want to offer that to you? Or will that upset the power dynamic? And then going down to wanting to fix, help, or rescue others. People really wanted to be helpful, and then found that they were crossing boundaries doing so. And so it's important to note that this is a self-analysis and a self-report. So this is what clergy are willing to say in an anonymous survey to me, is that what boundaries did they feel like they were struggling with most? What I found fascinating is the next question that I asked. What are the boundaries you think clergy as a whole most often cross over? And this is where some of the answers shifted. We got the first two that are the most common reasons that in the North Georgia Conference of the United Methodist Church, and my guess is a lot of other places, the two most common reasons individuals lose their clergy credentialing is due to sexual misconduct and financial misconduct. But the rest of them were very similar to what people named about their own wrestling. So the top two reasons people lose their credentials are nothing that anybody else said that they wrestle with, which is just kind of funny to me, that nobody's going to note those. But all the rest, where boundaries are a little more blurry, and it's a little grayer, is where people both admitted that their own wrestling happens and crossing over, and also where they're believing that other people are having this happen too. So again, congregants as friends, how do you hold boundaries in relationships? If you go a couple down, relationships after an appointment kind of falls in that category of where are boundaries, what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. workload kind of goes back to time of how much do we do and how much time do we have. And then being alone with parishioners. We often have emergencies where we need to be with people. When is acceptable to be alone with somebody? When is it hard to have that conversation that maybe I shouldn't be alone with somebody? It was fascinating that alcohol got listed by several people. That is not something that is commonly talked about in ethics training. Not something that anybody thought that they were crossing over, but a number of people were saying that they thought that it was something that their colleagues were crossing over. Balancing church and family. Again, this comes back to time. And then I think that the last three go together a lot. Oversharing and confidentiality, that we're telling people things that maybe if you have a close friend in the church, then you start to share that information, and that is not appropriate. It should be confidential. Or maybe it's your own personal oversharing. We do that when we want to feel connected with other people. It is kind of vulnerability is what connects people, but sometimes oversharing is when we start kind of having excessive vulnerability towards other people. And if we kind of word vomit something and share this deep personal thing, then maybe it will connect us with somebody else. So that's not how it works, but that's kind of how our brains think that we can quickly get to connection. And then the last two, getting too personally involved with other members and not referring out for counseling. We want to be helpful. We want to know that we are needed. We want to know that we are valued. And as a result, we probably do too much, things that are outside of our scope. And so we end up helping longer than we should. Our recommendation when I have taught ethics is after you meet with somebody for 2 times about the same topic, then it is clear that they need some additional support, and that sending somebody out for counseling would be helpful at that point, that they might need additional tools and not just a time of processing. And so this is the perception that people had of their colleagues and of each other. So it makes me start saying, what causes us to violate boundaries? It's helpful to have a definition of boundary violations. That's when someone has crossed over a boundary that has resulted in harm, potential harm, or exploitation to somebody else. So it's helpful to think about that every time we cross a boundary, that can be positive or negative or neutral. Boundary crossing is us connecting with other people. It can be through communication. It can be through physical touch. It can be through just however we're connecting with other people is crossing boundaries. Violating boundaries is when you cross a boundary that then leads to harm or potential harm along the way. So the question is, what are some contributing factors of boundary violations? What leads to clergy crossing these boundaries? I think that the first one is loneliness. Loneliness is on the rise in this country. I am sure that y'all have probably encountered a lot of the research that has happened in the last few years. One of the statistics that has stood out to me that in January of 2020, pre-pandemic, Cigna did a survey, and more than 3 in 5 Americans reported feeling lonely. More than 3 in 5. And so if that is the case, that was pre-pandemic, then what does that mean now? The other key thing to note about that is that young adults are twice as likely to be lonely as older adults. And so if we are bringing newer, younger people into ministry, and they are twice as likely as experiencing loneliness, then often when we are lonely, we start seeking out connection in any way that we can. So maybe that's through unhealthy relationships, relationships that we know that might be off limits, but we are not, that we're pursuing them anyway. Be it things, choices that will give us an adrenaline rush and a way to feel connected to other people. So loneliness can be a driving factor. The more that clergy get moved around, the more that key connections to other people is going to be important, because if you are lonely, you will start seeking out any sort of connection anywhere, even if it's a congregant that you are one-on-one with and shouldn't be. It's better than being alone sometimes. Burnout, we know so much about that it can lead to a boundary violation. When we are absolutely exhausted, we try to pick the quickest solution. And the quickest solution is rarely the healthiest solution. And so when we are burned out, we will often violate a boundary because we're just choosing something fast. Also, desperation and fear. I don't know if y'all have ever been in a place where you have felt fearful of the future, or we see it happening lots of places, fear of scarcity, that if we're not going to have enough, we are going to try to grab hold of things that we can, and that can lead to a boundary violation right there. Feeling too vulnerable and needing control. If we feel like people have seen too much about us and we are feeling in a vulnerable place, then we might try to exert our control in an inappropriate way and violate a boundary. And finally, poor mental health. Again, as we have named poor mental health in the past, it does not mean mental illness as a whole. It means having mental health symptoms and not willing to address them. So you can have good mental health and still have a mental illness diagnosis. Poor mental health is when your symptoms appear and you do none of the healthy steps to address them along the way. So some of these are the key factors that lead to those boundary violations that people mentioned in the previous slides. So the question is, which of these key contributing factors that we have just shared to boundary violations do you notice or experience most often with clergy?
Thank you, Lindsay. Incredibly helpful. One of the things we try to do is balance having practitioners and researchers that do work that's informed by scholarship, which it's very clear, Lindsay, you're doing, and very thought-provoking. So we want to send you to breakout groups again and ask this question and discuss from your expertise and experience what contributing factors that you have seen. So we'll be back in a little bit. I know, Lindsay, what you're bringing to us is stimulating just some fantastic conversation. So I want to turn it back over to you, and we want to hear more. So the key theme that was among all of those factors about that contributed to people violating boundaries that we named prior to our breakout time was lack of self-care. That was the common theme among it all. So the two big questions that I have, maybe that they're rhetorical, but do clergy not know what self-care is? Or are there barriers in the way of engaging self-care? And for us, again, I think that the wellness industry co-opted the term in such a way that people now start thinking of self-care as bubble bath, a pint of ice cream, massage, an exotic vacation, something like that, when it is not. But when people hear the word self-care, that is often what they think about. And so, as we know, self-care is often broken down into these four areas: physical, emotional,
social, and spiritual. And Westpath has added a fifth component of the financial component at times. So at each training I led, I started asking clergy what barriers make it challenging to prioritize self-care. And so I held a Mentimeter participation poll. I'm only going to show you one example. I taught this 10 times, and so have a variety of different examples, but they all look somewhat similar. So in the middle of the theme of almost all of them are time and expectations as the largest things that serve as a barrier to engaging in self-care. And what's wild is we all have the same amount of time. So is it perceived time during the day, how much time something would take, giving something up? And then it circles back to expectations. What are the expectations that other people have of us, that we have of ourselves? We were talking in our breakout group about overwork. Do we have expectations that we need to be able to respond every time somebody needs something? And so here are all the things that clergy are saying are standing in the way and serving as barriers to their own self-care. Money was often named, but not the largest one, which I always found fascinating. Money was actually not named in every session that we did this poll in. It was only in some of them. So while that is often listed as a barrier, and some conferences and organizations and churches will give clergy extra funding, that's not necessarily going to solve it. It sounds like expectations are more often a theme. So I wanted to give you all a moment to see this visually and to kind of soak it all in, that this is just one of 10 of these that I did with clergy. And by reading all of these, what I found is that there were 3 common themes. And as I said, finances were rarely a theme. It wasn't even listed in all of the 10 sessions that I led. And so time was the theme, expectations, and then family or caring for others. And this doesn't need to mean that you are married with kids. It could be any sort of family or community that you have. And so when I started thinking about these 3 things, this is all about a culture shift. These are not things that an outside organization can just come in and create more time in your life, or come in and automatically change everybody's preconceived expectations of other people, or change the needs of your family, or what your community and caring for your friends means. There needs to be a culture shift inside churches, and there needs to be a culture shift in clergy priorities of how do we, if these feel like a barrier, what are we going to do about it? So seeing these as themes, I want us to ask ourselves the question, what could help reduce these barriers to engaging in self-care? If the barriers are time, expectations, and family and caring for others, what could help reduce barriers to engaging in forms of self-care?
And we want to move into a time of Q&A with Lindsay. And so if you would just use the little raise your hand function, and we'll call on you to just unmute yourself and ask your question. I wanted to ask a question, Lindsay, and because I know you a bit, and we've talked about this a little bit before, I'm curious, given your licensed social worker training and experience, how has that training experience helped you as a pastor and caring for other pastors? I think I shared with you that my experience of working with social work colleagues at universities is that they tend to be very compassionate, but also have this really sort of magical way of getting down to bottom lines with people and getting things done and calling things for what they are, speaking the truth in love, those kinds of things. I'm curious how this blend of what you bring, you feel like is uniquely equipped you to help with these kinds of things.
I think even just asking the question about barriers is a common social worker question. Like, before we try to get to the end goal of something, or even provide an intervention, are there things that we haven't addressed up front that could limit the ability of that intervention even working along the way? I think about at part of my career, I served as a crisis intervention therapist, social worker in the homeless shelter. And at first, we tried to help people like build their relationship with God and all of that. And that had kind of been the old model. And everybody that didn't have a place to sleep that night said, I don't really care about talking about this. So I wonder for clergy, kind of what some of those things are that we're totally not addressing at all, that feel incredibly pressing, that they say, I can't even start thinking about that other stuff or caring for myself if we haven't done the X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. Thank you. It makes me think of a conversation I had with a spiritual director years ago where I was talking about my own ministry stress. I was in grad school at the time, and I was asking her about, managing ministry stress. And she said, Chris, you already know everything you should be doing to take care of yourself. That's not the question. You're an information junkie. You don't need more information. Why are you not doing what you know you should be doing? The question is, do you really want to be well? Which is the question Jesus asked the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda. And I've come back to that question many, many times in my own journey. We've got some other questions showing up here for you, Lindsay. What part do you think spiritual care retreats play in helping with all of this? And the caveat is, in my experience, they feel like going to a spiritual hospital, whereas tired pastors want more of a spiritual spa.
I love the way that's phrased. I mean, I think that the wonderful thing and the hard thing about retreats is that they are helpful in the moment, and help you kind of reset some of your equilibrium, perhaps. However, if it's not a long-term intervention, then we're going to slide back and need one again. And so it always feels so good when you leave something like that. Or at least I have felt really good when I have left something like that. And then thought, why can't I put this in the rest of my life? But I haven't shifted anything else in my life when I go back to regular real life.
Yeah, absolutely. I've found that to be the case too, in many ways. What other questions do you have? Or maybe as a follow-up to that, that is asking Andrew, say more what you mean about as spiritual spa.
Yeah,
I like that metaphor for us.
Yeah, I feel like spiritual care retreats are put on by practitioners, including myself, and we know what we think people need, but they don't necessarily think they need that. They just might need 24 hours with their spouse in a pretty location, whereas we want to give them lots of programming and seminars and here, take an hour with your journal and answer these 3 questions. And I feel like pastors have a much lower need for programming than we think they do, I guess. Whether they do or not is immaterial. It's more about what they think they need. And I think about why more pastors are not taking advantage of retreats that have been paid for, et cetera. There's something that is not drawing them the way I would want them to.
Yeah. That wasn't music playing you off like the Oscars, Andrew. That was an accident. Sorry about that. One of the comments here, Lindsay, is Andrew just identified what the church is often guilty of. Is what you're identifying, Lindsay, from your social work expertise, that we assume what people want or need rather than asking them what they need. I think you were going to respond to that.
Yeah, I just even think about if clergy really need that respite, with their partner or just doing nothing for a day or something, and we overprogram people. It goes back to asking, kind of meeting certain needs of Maslow's hierarchy ahead of time. If people really need rest and absolutely nothing, we need to offer that and then tack on programming that could then, once people are rested, they're better going to be able to hear and listen and engage in the programming. But if I'm burned out, programming is not the thing that's going to feel helpful in that moment.
Yeah.
So maybe it's a both and if we come from a social work approach of Maslow's hierarchies. Have we met their basic needs before we start adding other things on?
And we have a comment about that from Candace that they host a quarterly pastor's lunch and they feed them and then the pastors take a nap. And so we're meeting some of those basic needs, which may be what they need most. Another question here, Lindsay, is how effective is engaging in regular professional supervision in helping clergy maintain ethics and attend to self-care?
I think it kind of depends on how we're defining supervision as a whole. I think that kind of if you have more informal mentorship and clergy colleagues in a support group or a therapist or spiritual director, if you have built trust in those spaces and you can bring questions to those spaces, I think that is incredibly helpful because then you can have conversations of, is this a slippery slope? If I do this, what could happen? I think if we're talking about a supervisor in the United Methodist world, like your district superintendent or somebody that has power over your appointment or something like that, that's not always a trustworthy place to be able to help you answer questions and make sure that you don't violate boundaries. So this again comes back to make sure that you have a clergy community, some sort of cohort, make sure you have a spiritual director, a coach, or a therapist that you can say these things to that people won't say elsewhere. I see a lot of pastors in my counseling practice that want to both talk about themselves and also just process through some boundary questions here and there of what if I did this or said that.
Yeah. And last quick question, Lindsay, you mentioned earlier in your comments, I thought it was such an insightful comment. Sometimes people end up crossing boundaries because the boundaries are blurry and they're just unclear. So maybe just say a little bit about how can we help clergy clarify those blurry areas so that they respond in an ethical way in those situations?
I think the best way to approach somewhat blurry boundaries is communication. If we don't communicate about boundaries, we're going to bump up against it. It's like us wandering in the dark and not knowing where the wall is in the room and then bumping into it. But if somebody talked you through it, you would know where the wall was and you wouldn't just ram into it. And so when it comes to other people's boundaries and our own, we may run into them at full speed if we're not communicating along the way. So that's where I think congregations and clergy need to have a list of all of their expectations of the other person's role, and then even start calculating the hours. Okay, if it's let's say you have a 40-hour work week, which I know is not what any pastor actually has, but let's just use that numbers wise. If you have a 40-hour work week and then they assume you want to preach something on Sunday, they might want a sermon out of you. So, and that takes more than an hour. So let's say that takes 10 hours a week to write that and prep that. Then you help the church say, okay, now we have 30 hours to work with. What's your next priority along the way? It's amazing, especially for clergy that are serving in part-time appointments. Having these conversations helps the congregants start realize what is realistic and what is not in their expectations. And I think the whole thing can happen vice versa as well. Clergy trying to figure out what are their expectations for their own congregations. Are they realistic or are they not?
Yes. So good. echo all of that in my experience too. Lindsay, thank you so much. Your clinical expertise and pastoral heart both come through loud and clear. And so thank you for carving out time to prepare for this and to be with us in this way. If you wouldn't mind putting your contact info in the chat for everybody in case people want to follow up with you after today, that'd be wonderful. Thank you all for being with us.